It's an enormous pleasure for me to be here on behalf of the US Study Centre and to be associated with James Hansen's visit to Sydney. Let me give you just a very brief introduction of Dr. Hansen because I know you all want to hear from him rather than from me. James Hansen is an Iowan and a proud son of that state, receiving 3 degrees from the University of Iowa, a BA, an MS, and a PhD, all in physics. Since 1981, he has been director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. Since 1985, he's also been in New York City, an adjunct professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Columbia University. In 1996, he was awarded the single highest honor that can be bestowed upon a scientist in the United States, which was his election to the National Academy of Sciences. In 2006, spreading the accolades around the globe, he was awarded for the World Wildlife Federation its Duke of Edinburgh Conservation Medal, 2006. Also in 2006, he was named by Time magazine as one of the world's 100 most influential people. And I think the popular acclaim for Dr. Hansen really is owed to the signature year of 1988, in which he led a team at the Goddard Institute, which for the first time published a scientifically credible study showing that our planet was warming. Later that year, he testified in some famous hearings in the US Senate, in the Congress, on global warming, influencing, I think at that time still, Senator Al Gore to become a passionate advocate of the issue, and leading Al Gore, Nobel Prize-winning former Vice President, former Senator Al Gore, to say of Dr. Hansen, "When the history of the climate crisis is written, Hansen will be seen as the scientist with the most powerful and consistent voice calling for intelligent action to preserve our planet's environment." Quite an accolade from Al Gore. In addition to his more publicly noted work, Dr. Hansen has written literally hundreds of articles in the world's leading science journals on the subject of tonight's presentation, and you'll see, I just managed to flip through his PowerPoint deck. You're in for a significant educational experience on climate change, in addition to probably some pretty significant and interesting, I won't say controversial, remarks on the direction of climate change policy in the world today. In addition to all the articles that Dr. Hansen has written, he's also the author of a very recent book, which Meredith has already mentioned, Storms of My Grandchildren. Let me just read from the Los Angeles Times book review of that book. The LA Times said that the book was written by a scientist at the breaking point, the point at which he is willing to sacrifice his credibility to make a stand to avert disaster, to offer up the fruits of 4+ decades of inquiry and ingenuity just in case he might change the course of history. Indeed, people call Dr. Hansen, and since it's in the title of his book, I can say it without feeling at all strange about it, not the father of climate science, but the grandfather of climate science. 2 generations now of climate scientists obviously engaged in the global debate. Of course, he's anything but the cliche of what grandfatherly might connote for many of you. In fact, he's been an extraordinarily powerful public voice in the climate change debate, certainly in the last few months, saying some things that I think some of you might find quite interesting. I think in an op-ed piece in the New York Times in early December, that is before the Copenhagen Climate Change Summit, Dr. Hansen said it would be a good thing if the Copenhagen Summit failed. He also criticized Barack Obama and Kevin Rudd for thinking that emissions trading schemes were an important part of the solution to the climate change challenge. And he's been a long-term critic of the coal industry, I think presumably even including the new notion of clean coal, for its role in climate change. And of course, in Australia, I don't have to tell anyone in this audience that coal is Australia's #1 export earner to the world. I think only followed second by iron ore, also not doing a lot for the cause of climate change. So what we have tonight before us is a scientist of an extraordinary pedigree who has taken some of the boldest and most courageous stands in public one can think of. I couldn't be more pleased to welcome to the stage Dr. James Hansen.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Yeah, the debacle in Copenhagen, I think, actually, the failure to achieve an accord to reduce carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere, I think that could actually be helpful if we instead move toward an approach that is actually effective. So let me, in the last year or two, when I've given talks, I often start out by saying there's a large gap between what is understood about global warming and what is known about global warming. Understood by the relevant scientific community and known by the people who need to know, and that's the public and policymakers. Now, incredibly, in the last 6 months, that gap has widened noticeably. The science has crystallized, has become clearer. Some of the issues that were still loose ends at the time I was writing my book have been clarified in the last 6 months, and yet the public's perception of the issue has become less certain, as in part due to the fact that the people who prefer to continue business as usual have perpetrated a great hoax on the public, which I will come back to in a few minutes. The truth is that it is clear that we have a crisis, a planetary emergency. And it's hard for the public to see this because the climate change, global warming, is small in comparison to weather fluctuations from day to day. But one of the reasons that it is a crisis is that the climate system has tremendous inertia, due in part to the ocean, which is 4 kilometers deep, and the ice sheets, which are a couple of kilometers thick. These respond only slowly to changes in the forcing mechanisms that humans or nature applies to them. So as a result, the planet, because of the large thermal inertia of the ocean, has warmed only about half as much so far as it will eventually due to the gases that are already in the atmosphere, let alone those that we're continuing to add every year. And the problem with that is that the climate system has tipping points. You can push the system beyond a point where the dynamics of the system begins to take over and you begin to get relatively rapid change, which is out of control of humanity. The bad news is that what has become clear is that the safe level of atmospheric carbon dioxide is no higher than 350 parts per million. and we've already caused it to increase from 280 parts per million in the pre-industrial atmosphere to almost 390 parts per million now. But the good news is that it is still possible to go back to less than 350 ppm. And there are other reasons why that makes sense and other advantages of doing that. Now, just to say a few words about tipping points. One of them is in the case of ice sheets. For example, if an ice sheet begins to, if it reaches the point where it's beginning to disintegrate and large portions of it sliding toward the ocean, well, by that time it's too late. You can't tie a rope around an ice sheet which is a couple of kilometers thick. And the way that works is the most important process seems to be the warming of the ocean. As it gets slightly warmer, it begins to melt the ice shelves, which are the tongues of ice that reach out from the ice sheets into the ocean, go under the ocean water. Those ice shelves around both Antarctica and Greenland are melting now at a rate of several meters per year. And as they melt, that allows those ice shelves buttress the ice sheet. And so as they disappear, then the ice streams, the more plastic parts of the ice sheet, move more rapidly and discharge icebergs to the ocean more rapidly. And they can reach the point at which the ice sheet begins to disintegrate. Another tipping point is occurs in the case of the extermination of species. As the climate zones shift, it begins to put pressure on species. We're putting pressure on species in a number of different ways, but one of the most important is the climate change that is beginning to be consistent and cause a given isotherm or temperature line to move poleward at a rate of about 60 to 70 kilometers per decade for the last 3 decades. And at first, this is not a problem, but as that continues and goes faster, then the climate zones are moving rapidly, and species can only live within certain climate zones. So some of them will be, which cannot migrate rapidly, will go extinct. And as some go extinct because of the interdependencies among them, whole ecosystems can begin to collapse. And this is not a hypothetical thing. We know that it's happened during the Earth's history, during large global warming. Several times in the Earth's past, there were mass extinctions of half or more of the species on the planet. And then over hundreds of thousands and millions of years, new species came into being, but for any time scale that humans could imagine, we would have a much more desolate planet if we drive a species to extinction. Now, I want to emphasize the intergenerational injustice, inequity in in human-made climate change. This is my first grandchild. I started to show this photo initially because the newspaper had called me the grandfather of global warming, and I wanted to show I really was a grandfather. And it wasn't, I didn't immediately, it wasn't, you know, after testifying in 1988 and 1989, I realized that that public stuff was really not my cup of tea, and I preferred to do science, and I decided to get out of the public aspect of this. And when I got interview requests from the media, I would refer them to a couple of friends of mine, Steve Schneider and Michael Oppenheimer, who were articulate and they enjoy that process. And so for 15 years, I maintained that resolve until 2004, the middle of the Bush administration, by which time it had become clear that the government, our government, was not doing anything to address this issue. And furthermore, they were actually censoring science, trying to prevent the public from understanding the full nature of it. And so I decided I was going to give one talk and try to prepare that carefully and the papers to back it up. And rationalize that by saying I didn't want my grandchildren to say Opa understood what was happening, but he never made it clear. Because eventually the people in the future are going to look back on